Shah Jahan had everything: wealth, power, and an empire that seemed unstoppable. But then, one illness changed everything. Because while the emperor lay dying, his 4 sons began fighting for one throne, and the Mughal Empire would never be the same again. By the closing months of 1645, news reached Emperor Shah Jahan from Lahore of the death of a woman who had once stood at the very center of Mughal power. Nur Jahan was dead. She was 68 years old. Her death immediately gave rise to sensational stories. In the bazaars, rumors spread that the former empress had been murdered. Such stories were not unusual in a world where palace politics, imperial rivalries, and sudden deaths often became the subject of speculation. But the official historical accounts tell a different story. According to those records, Nur Jahan died of natural causes. By this stage of her life, the political circumstances that had once made her so formidable had disappeared. After the death of her husband, Emperor Jahangir, Nur Jahan had withdrawn into the secluded existence of a widow. She no longer possessed the same opportunities to interfere in imperial affairs, and Shah Jahan had little reason to consider her a serious political danger. His response to her former influence was therefore not assassination, but gradual removal. Shah Jahan largely ignored Nur Jahan as an individual while systematically dismantling the political legacy she had left behind. Coins that carried her name were withdrawn from circulation. Officials who had once been loyal to her were removed from positions of influence. Piece by piece, the visible traces of her authority disappeared from the Mughal court. Yet Nur Jahan's place in history could not be erased so easily. Mughal historians would remember her very differently, depending largely upon their own political loyalties. Many criticized the extraordinary influence she had exercised over Jahangir. They regarded the power she accumulated during his reign with suspicion or disapproval. But even her critics could not deny the extraordinary nature of her rise. Nur Jahan had achieved a position of influence that few women in Mughal history had ever reached. Her success was partly connected to the weaknesses of Jahangir himself, but it was also the result of her own political abilities. Her intelligence, determination, and capacity for influence had helped carry her from the margins of imperial society to the heart of Mughal power. Now, after decades of political struggle, her story had reached its final chapter. But even in death, her funeral revealed how dramatically her circumstances had changed. The ceremony was modest. There was none of the elaborate imperial spectacle that had accompanied the death of Mumtaz Mahal. Nur Jahan's body was placed inside a marble sarcophagus in the tomb she had commissioned for herself, close to the tomb of her husband, Jahangir. The construction of her tomb had begun in 1641. That year had already witnessed another major loss in the political world surrounding Shah Jahan. Nur Jahan's brother, Asaf Khan, had died. For Nur Jahan, his death marked the loss of her brother. For Shah Jahan, however, Asaf Khan had been much more. He had served as the emperor's chief minister. He was also Shah Jahan's father-in-law, the father of Mumtaz Mahal. Despite the death of Mumtaz, the relationship between Shah Jahan and Asaf Khan had remained strong. Their connection was not merely political. It was also bound by family. A remarkable account by the Portuguese friar Sebastião Manrique provides a glimpse into the extraordinary world in which that relationship existed. Manrique claimed that he had witnessed a banquet at which Asaf Khan entertained Shah Jahan. The setting reflected the immense wealth and refinement of the Mughal elite. The chamber was decorated with richly worked carpets, featuring embroidery of silk, silver, and gold. Around the hall stood large silver perfume holders and braziers of elaborate craftsmanship. Sweet fragrances were burned within them, filling the room with perfume. Water flowed from a fountain with 7 spouts. The entire scene was designed to surround the emperor with luxury. Beautiful attendants placed golden ewers upon a table covered with white satin, preparing for the emperor's ritual washing before the meal. Eunuchs, richly dressed in the Hindustani style, served the banquet. They wore trousers made from silks of different colors, combined with fine white coats of extremely delicate, transparent muslin. Every detail of the ceremony reflected the wealth and sophistication of Shah Jahan's court. But during the meal, one moment carried a significance that went beyond the display of luxury. Shah Jahan turned his attention to Asaf Khan's wife. She was the mother of Mumtaz Mahal. The emperor addressed her as his mother. Then he invited her to sit at his right hand, the place of honor. It was a gesture that revealed the continuing bond between Shah Jahan and the family of his beloved wife, even years after Mumtaz's death. But while the memories of Mumtaz remained part of Shah Jahan's world, the emperor's ambitions were moving forward. The Taj Mahal was now largely complete. Yet Shah Jahan's appetite for grand architecture had not diminished. If anything, his ambitions were becoming even greater. He continued to invest in monumental and expensive construction projects. In 1647, he began building the Moti Masjid, the Pearl Mosque, within the Red Fort at Agra. It was an exquisite project, worthy of the emperor's passion for architecture. But the Pearl Mosque was still not the greatest vision Shah Jahan had in mind. His grandest plans were being prepared for Delhi. There, he would create an entirely new imperial metropolis. Its name would be Shahjahanabad. The city would rise on the western bank of the Jumna River. And it would become the latest of the great cities of Delhi established by successive Islamic dynasties that had ruled the region since the 12th century. For Shah Jahan, the creation of Shahjahanabad was about more than simply constructing another capital. He wanted an imperial city that expressed his power. He searched for a location where the climate would be more favorable, where a magnificent fortress could rise, where beautiful buildings could stand beside flowing water, and where terraces could look out across the river. His historian, Inayat Khan, recorded this vision of the emperor's ideal city. Shah Jahan wanted water to move through the new capital. He wanted architecture and landscape to exist together. He wanted the river to become part of the city's identity. But there was also a practical reason behind his decision. The heat of Hindustan had always been difficult for the Mughal rulers. Shah Jahan himself found the climate oppressive, just as his predecessors had. Agra's hot and searing winds were another burden. A new capital in Delhi offered the emperor an opportunity to create an environment better suited to his vision. And perhaps there was another reason as well. Agra was inseparable from memories of Mumtaz Mahal. The city had witnessed the final years of their life together. The Taj Mahal had risen there from the grief of her death. Whether Shah Jahan consciously sought distance from those memories cannot be proven. But the move toward a new imperial capital created a new chapter in his reign. Work on Shahjahanabad had begun in 1630. And, just as with the Taj Mahal, construction advanced rapidly. An enormous workforce was mobilized. At the heart of the new metropolis rose a vast citadel, the Red Fort. Massive sandstone walls surrounded the fortress city. 27 towers strengthened its imposing defenses. 11 great gates provided entry into the enormous complex. The scale of the project was extraordinary. The new Red Fort was twice the size of the Red Fort at Agra. But Shahjahanabad was not designed merely as a fortress. It was conceived as a complete imperial capital. Grand avenues connected its different sections. The city contained its bazaars, where merchants and traders conducted business. Administrative offices housed the machinery of government. Residences were provided for courtiers and members of the imperial elite. The emperor's chambers of state formed the political heart of the capital. And beyond these public and administrative spaces lay the private world of the imperial harem. Its pavilions were designed with extraordinary luxury, decorated with gold and precious inlaid jewels. In Shahjahanabad, Shah Jahan was not simply building another palace or another monument. He was creating an entire city around the idea of imperial power. A city where government, commerce, court life, military strength, and royal luxury would exist within one carefully planned world. The Taj Mahal had been a monument born from personal loss. Shahjahanabad was something different. It was the physical expression of an emperor's ambition to reshape the very center of his empire. And as the walls of the new capital rose along the Jumna, Shah Jahan's architectural vision was becoming larger than any single building. He was no longer simply constructing monuments. He was constructing an imperial world. When visitors entered Shah Jahan's new imperial capital, they encountered something more than monumental architecture. The city had been designed around comfort as much as grandeur. Accounts from the period describe rooms supplied with running water near their entrances, gardens woven into the urban landscape, shaded paths and secluded retreats. Streams and fountains brought movement into the architecture, while specially designed underground spaces offered protection from the intense heat of the day. Elevated platforms and terraces provided another advantage. When the temperature finally dropped after sunset, these open spaces allowed people to rest in the cooler night air. The result was an imperial environment in which water, greenery, architecture, and climate were deliberately brought together. One of the most important water channels ran through the imperial quarters. It was known as the River of Paradise. Its design reflected the precision of Mughal water engineering. The channel was constructed with an extremely gentle gradient, just enough to keep the water flowing continuously, but so subtle that the slope itself was almost impossible to detect. This was not simply decoration. The movement of water was an essential part of the experience of the imperial city. It cooled the environment, animated the gardens, and connected the architecture through a carefully controlled system of flowing water. Within this world stood the Rang Mahal, the principal building of the imperial harem. The palace was constructed in shimmering white marble. At each of its four corners were smaller chambers whose interiors were decorated with countless tiny mirrors. When light entered these spaces, the surfaces reflected it in every direction, transforming the rooms into dazzling chambers of light. But even the Rang Mahal was not the ultimate expression of Shah Jahan's architectural taste. That distinction belonged to the emperor's hall of private audience. Unlike a massive enclosed chamber, this was an open marble pavilion. Its surfaces were decorated with precious stones arranged in floral patterns. The effect was deliberate. The stonework created the impression of a garden made not from plants, but from jewels. Above it all was a ceiling decorated in silver and gold. Here, Shah Jahan's vision reached its most refined form. Architecture was no longer merely functional. It had become an instrument of imperial spectacle. And soon, the city itself would become the stage for one of the most magnificent ceremonies of Shah Jahan's reign. The inauguration of Shahjahanabad unfolded over 10 days of elaborate celebration. The preparations alone demonstrated the scale of the Mughal court. 3,000 workers spent an entire month constructing an enormous canopy inside the courtyard of the new fort. The structure required powerful cranks and hoists to raise it into position. Its velvet fabric had been woven on the looms of Gujarat and embroidered with gold. Its dimensions were extraordinary. The canopy was large enough to provide shade for 10,000 people. Then came the decisive day. April 18, 1648. The Mughal court had selected the exact moment considered most favorable by its astrologers. As the appointed hour approached, the atmosphere inside the new imperial capital was filled with ceremony. Kettledrums sounded, and Shah Jahan arrived by royal barge. The emperor entered the new capital not simply as its ruler, but as the sovereign whose name had been given to the city itself. Then he ascended the Peacock Throne. The throne was itself a statement of Mughal power. It was made of gold and covered with precious gemstones. Above it rose brilliantly crafted birds whose eyes seemed to glow with jewels. For European visitors who were fortunate enough to see it, the spectacle was almost overwhelming. Sebastian Manrique, who had witnessed the magnificence of the Mughal court, was particularly struck by the throne. He described its diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires with a sense of astonishment. His reaction reveals something important about the impression Shah Jahan's court made upon outsiders. The throne was not designed simply to provide a seat for the emperor. It was a physical demonstration of wealth. Every gemstone communicated power. Every precious metal represented resources. Every detail reinforced the distance between the emperor and everyone who stood before him. And in that sense, the Peacock Throne was the perfect symbol of Shah Jahan's empire. By this period, Shah Jahan was probably the wealthiest monarch of the 17th century. His annual income was estimated at 220 million rupees. Beyond that enormous revenue stood imperial treasure houses filled with precious metals and rare jewels worth many millions more. The wealth concentrated around the emperor seemed almost limitless. But beneath the brilliance was a deeper problem. The Peacock Throne represented not only the wealth of the Mughal state. It also revealed the growing weaknesses within its financial system. Imperial revenues had risen to 3 times the level they had reached during the reign of Akbar. At first glance, this appeared to demonstrate extraordinary economic success. But the increase had not primarily come from expanding the empire's territory. Nor had it been achieved by making existing lands dramatically more productive through improved agricultural methods. Trade had not been transformed into the principal engine of this growth either. Instead, much of the burden had fallen upon the people who lived under Mughal rule. As Shah Jahan's reign continued, imperial tax collectors increasingly pressed the population for greater revenues. The pressure became severe. Many of Shah Jahan's subjects responded by protecting whatever wealth they could. Rather than allowing their savings to remain visible and accessible to tax collectors, they converted their wealth into precious metals and gemstones and hid it away. That behavior created a dangerous cycle. Money and wealth that might otherwise have circulated through the economy were removed from circulation. The result was not greater economic energy, but stagnation. The empire was collecting more. Yet the system supporting that revenue was becoming increasingly rigid. And there was another imbalance. Although imperial income had tripled compared with the days of Akbar, imperial spending had increased even faster. Expenditure had risen to 4 times the level of Akbar's reign. The Mughal state was therefore generating enormous revenues while simultaneously consuming them at an even greater rate. Behind the splendor of Shahjahanabad, behind the gold of the Peacock Throne, Behind the jewels that dazzled foreign visitors, the foundations of imperial finance were becoming increasingly strained. Shah Jahan had inherited an administrative structure established under Akbar and continued under Jahangir. Like his predecessors, he organized the imperial hierarchy by assigning ranks and salaries to nobles and officials. But the wealth displayed at the center of the empire came at a growing cost. The monuments were magnificent. The ceremonies were spectacular. The court was richer than almost any European visitor could imagine. Yet beneath that glittering surface, the financial machinery of the Mughal Empire was becoming increasingly dependent upon extracting more from the people who sustained it. The Peacock Throne therefore stood as a paradox. It represented the extraordinary wealth of Shah Jahan's empire. But it also symbolized the danger of a system in which imperial magnificence continued to expand while the financial foundations beneath it grew increasingly fragile. The Mughal military system was beginning to reveal a serious weakness. Under Shah Jahan's administration, nobles were assigned ranks that carried specific obligations. The higher a noble's rank, the greater the number of soldiers and horses he was expected to maintain. But the system was increasingly being distorted by political necessity. Shah Jahan needed the loyalty of powerful factions within his empire. To keep influential supporters satisfied, ranks continued to rise, and with them, the incomes attached to those positions. The problem was that the military strength represented on paper did not always exist in reality. Some nobles maintained only a fraction of the troops their official rank required. When the time came for an imperial inspection, they could temporarily borrow horses and soldiers from other nobles, creating the appearance of military strength that was far greater than what they actually possessed. The deception could go even further. Some officials responsible for enforcing the system were themselves corrupt. Nobles could sometimes secure their cooperation through bribery, while those same officials exploited the population under their authority for personal gain. The result was a damaging exchange of corruption. Powerful nobles were protected from scrutiny. Officials enriched themselves, and ordinary subjects carried an increasing share of the burden. Shah Jahan understood that the financial situation was becoming dangerous. His expenditures were rising much faster than his income, and the expanding system of ranks and salaries was consuming an ever larger portion of imperial resources. He attempted to slow the growth. But the emperor faced a political dilemma. A severe reduction in ranks or salaries could alienate the very supporters whose loyalty helped sustain his rule. So his efforts to control the spending remained limited. The flow of money from the imperial treasury continued. And Shah Jahan still had another passion that demanded enormous resources: architecture. Even as the financial pressure increased, the emperor continued to invest heavily in monumental construction. In 1650, he ordered the construction of a new mosque in Shahjahanabad. It would become the Jami Masjid, the largest mosque in the Mughal Empire. For the next 6 years, construction transformed the skyline of the imperial capital. The great mosque rose above the city with 3 enormous domes constructed from sandstone and marble. 2 towering minarets completed its monumental appearance. It was not simply another building within Shahjahanabad. It was a statement of imperial ambition, religious identity, and architectural power. And it would become the final major building project undertaken by Shah Jahan. Yet the cost of such ambition was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. A saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad warned against architecture as a costly pursuit that consumed the wealth of believers. Whether or not that principle was directly applied to Shah Jahan's own projects, the financial reality of his reign was becoming clear. Determining the exact cost of the emperor's construction program is difficult. The chronicles do not always record every expense. In some cases, the reported figures may have excluded important costs, including materials. The frequently cited figure of 5 million rupees for the Taj Mahal, attributed to the historian Lahori, may be an example of this problem. The true total may therefore have been considerably more complicated than the figures preserved in the chronicles suggest. Even conservative calculations, however, indicate the scale of Shah Jahan's commitment to architecture. Between roughly 10 and 20% of the Mughal treasury's annual expenditure was being directed toward buildings. The exact amount spent by the imperial government is itself difficult to calculate with precision. But the proportion is significant. This was wealth being directed toward monuments, palaces, mosques, and the visual grandeur of the imperial court. It was not primarily being invested in strengthening military defenses. Nor was it focused on improving the routes that carried supplies and communications across the empire. The buildings served another purpose. They projected the power of the Mughal state. They transformed the imperial capital. And they satisfied Shah Jahan's extraordinary commitment to beauty and architectural perfection. But every monument had a price. The continued construction drained the treasury at a time when imperial spending was already accelerating. And the obsession with monumental projects also demanded the attention of the emperor and his officials. Resources that might have been directed toward strengthening the administration, improving prosperity, or preparing the empire to withstand internal unrest and external threats were instead being absorbed by the pursuit of architectural magnificence. The consequences would not become immediately visible. But the imbalance was growing. The empire appeared stronger than ever. Its cities were more magnificent. Its palaces more luxurious. Its monuments more spectacular. Yet beneath that brilliance, the financial foundations were becoming increasingly strained. And for Shah Jahan himself, another kind of crisis had never truly disappeared. The loss of Mumtaz Mahal had left a void that wealth and architecture could not fill. For nearly 2 decades, she had been his closest companion. After her death, Shah Jahan sought other forms of distraction. European travelers reported that he became involved with numerous women. Some of these accounts may have been exaggerated or shaped by the fascination of foreign observers with the private life of an enormously powerful ruler. Yet the number and detail of the reports suggest that there may have been a genuine basis behind them. The pattern also offers an important perspective on another rumor surrounding the emperor. Stories had circulated about an alleged physical relationship between Shah Jahan and his daughter Jahanara. But the reports of his numerous other partners make that claim appear less convincing. If Jahanara had truly taken the place of Mumtaz in that sense, the argument goes, Shah Jahan's behavior would likely have been very different. The evidence remains uncertain. But the rumors themselves reveal the degree to which the private life of the emperor fascinated those who watched the Mughal court from the outside. One of the places associated with these stories was the Meena Bazaar. According to the Venetian traveler Niccolao Minucci, the event offered Shah Jahan an opportunity to move through a marketplace where women displayed goods for sale. Minucci described the emperor arriving with a large entourage. He was carried on a small throne by women of Tartar origin and accompanied by matrons, eunuchs, and female musicians. The atmosphere was ceremonial, but the account also presents the bazaar as a place where the emperor could personally choose items that caught his attention. According to Minucci's description, Shah Jahan would indicate what he wished to purchase, and the price would be paid to the seller. Afterward, the emperor's attendants would take responsibility for arranging what happened next. Minucci claimed that some of the women eventually returned from the palace wealthy and satisfied, while others remained there as concubines. This account must be treated carefully. It was written by a European observer, describing the private customs of a distant royal court, and such stories could easily become embellished as they passed from one traveler to another. Yet Minucci's account provides a glimpse into how the Mughal court was perceived by outsiders. He also described rumors involving the wives of some of Shah Jahan's nobles. According to his colorful narrative, when these women passed through the streets in formal processions, members of the public would make provocative remarks connecting them to the emperor. Whether these stories were literally accurate is impossible to establish from such accounts alone. What they do demonstrate is the extraordinary fascination surrounding Shah Jahan's private life. The same traveler also claimed that the emperor had ordered the construction of a large hall connected to these private pursuits. His description continues beyond the surviving account, leaving the details of the structure and its alleged purpose to the historical record. Taken together, these stories present a striking contrast. Shah Jahan was remembered as the ruler who built some of the most magnificent structures of the Mughal age. He presided over immense wealth. He created a new imperial capital and commissioned monumental architecture on a scale few rulers could match. But behind the marble and gemstones was a more complicated reality. His military system was weakened by corruption. His nobles were rewarded with increasingly expensive ranks. Taxation placed growing pressure on his subjects. Imperial expenditure was rising faster than revenue. And the emperor continued to spend heavily on architecture even as the treasury faced mounting demands. At the same time, the personal loss of Mumtaz had changed the man behind the throne. Shah Jahan's public image was one of magnificence and control. His private life, according to contemporary and later accounts, was far less stable. The empire was reaching the height of its visible splendor. But beneath that surface, financial pressure, political compromise, administrative corruption, and personal grief were quietly reshaping the world of the great Mughal. European travelers left some of the most striking, and controversial, descriptions of Shah Jahan's private life. One of the most extraordinary accounts concerned a hall decorated with an astonishing quantity of mirrors. According to the report, the walls were covered with great mirrors, while the spaces between them were richly ornamented with gold. The ceiling carried bands of gold decorated with pearls, and large clusters of pearls were suspended at the corners of the mirrors. The walls themselves were said to be made of jasper stone. The expense was enormous. The account claimed that the gold alone had cost 15 million rupees. That figure did not include the enamel work or the precious stones incorporated into the decoration, whose value was apparently never recorded. But the European observer did not describe the hall simply as an example of imperial luxury. He presented it as evidence of Shah Jahan's private appetites, claiming that the emperor had created such extravagance for his own pleasure and for the women who accompanied him. The judgment was severe. The observer portrayed Shah Jahan as a ruler increasingly consumed by the pursuit of women and sensual pleasure. Such accounts must be treated carefully. European travelers were outsiders to the Mughal court, and their descriptions could be exaggerated, moralizing, or shaped by their own cultural assumptions. Yet another European visitor, François Bernier, also described the emperor's fascination with entertainment at court. Bernier wrote about a troupe of dancing girls whose performances amused Shah Jahan. In Bernier's judgment, some of their behavior crossed what he considered the limits of decency. He also claimed that Shah Jahan could become so interested in one of these performers that he ordered her admission into the imperial harem. Bernier attributed to the emperor a blunt justification for such choices, that something of value could come from any source. Whether the precise words were ever spoken by Shah Jahan cannot be established with certainty. But Bernier's account contributes to a larger picture of the imperial court as a place where extraordinary wealth, entertainment, music, dancing, and personal indulgence existed alongside the formal rituals of kingship. And yet, despite all these reports of women surrounding the emperor, there was a striking difference between Shah Jahan's later life and the years he had spent with Mumtaz Mahal. He had no more children who could rival the large family he had fathered with Mumtaz. This absence became a subject of speculation among European observers. Some wondered whether pregnancies inside the imperial harem were being deliberately terminated through some form of abortion. But this remains speculation, not established historical fact. What is clearer is that Shah Jahan never found another relationship that equaled the one he had shared with Mumtaz Mahal. With Mumtaz, his life had combined physical intimacy with friendship, companionship, and trust. Their relationship had developed over nearly 2 decades, and her death had left an absence that wealth and pleasure could not easily fill. Later observers have therefore interpreted Shah Jahan's repeated pursuit of other women in different ways. One possibility is that he was simply pursuing pleasure. Another interpretation is that he was searching, unsuccessfully, for a replacement for the relationship he had lost. From this perspective, the endless pursuit of new partners may have reflected not satisfaction, but the inability to recover something unique. Mumtaz Mahal could not be replaced. And perhaps, in the years after her death, Shah Jahan's behavior was itself a measure of how deeply he had been affected by her absence. But while the emperor's private life became increasingly consumed by luxury and pleasure, another major change was taking place within the structure of imperial power. Shah Jahan was gradually stepping away from direct involvement in military campaigns. Earlier in his reign, he had generally preferred to remain close to military operations. He did not necessarily fight personally on the battlefield, but he liked to position himself near the action and maintain direct oversight. By the late 1640s, that pattern had changed. Shah Jahan was now increasingly occupied with his monumental building projects, the elaborate daily rituals of the Mughal court, and the private world that surrounded him. Military campaigns were being entrusted more and more to his 4 sons. By 1648, when Shah Jahan established his residence in Shahjahanabad, all 4 princes were mature men. The eldest was Dara Shukoh. He was 33 years old. Dara was very different from the conventional image of a warrior prince. He was intellectually curious, artistic, and open-minded. His greatest interests were often found in scholarship, philosophy, literature, and religion rather than on the battlefield. In this respect, Dara resembled some of the more intellectually adventurous Mughal rulers who had come before him, particularly his great-grandfather, Akbar. Dara was deeply interested in the relationship between different religious traditions. He explored connections between elements of Hindu religious thought and Sufism, the mystical tradition within Islam. Rather than viewing the 2 traditions as completely separate worlds, Dara searched for philosophical connections between them. His intellectual curiosity eventually led him toward the Upanishads, the major philosophical texts of Hindu thought. Dara arranged for the Upanishads to be translated into Persian. This was a significant intellectual undertaking because Persian was the principal language of the Mughal court and of much of its elite literary culture. Through such work, Dara attempted to bring Hindu philosophical ideas into conversation with the Persian-speaking Islamic intellectual world. His interests also extended beyond scholarship. Dara wrote poetry and became known as a talented calligrapher. He was also associated with support for Hindu religious institutions. According to the account, Dara persuaded his father, Shah Jahan, to donate a stone railing to a Hindu temple. This was consistent with Dara's broader interest in religious dialogue and intellectual exchange. But Dara's strengths also had a darker side. The French traveler François Bernier, who observed the Mughal princes, described Dara as polite and broad-minded. Yet Bernier believed that the prince had an exaggerated opinion of his own abilities. In Bernier's assessment, Dara trusted his intellect so completely that he believed he could accomplish almost anything through the power of his own mind. That confidence could become arrogance. And in the brutal political environment of the Mughal dynasty, intellectual brilliance alone would not necessarily be enough to secure power. The second prince was Shah Shuja. Shah Shuja was 31 years old in 1648. In some respects, he resembled Dara. But politically, he was more practical. Where Dara often showed little interest in cultivating powerful nobles, believing that the everyday maneuvering of court politics was beneath him, Shah Shuja understood the value of political relationships. He knew how to cultivate influential men. He understood how to acquire useful friends. And he was an accomplished political intriguer. But Bernier also described another side of his character. Shah Shuja was deeply attached to pleasure. According to Bernier, he was surrounded by a very large number of women, and when he was in their company, he could spend entire days and nights immersed in entertainment. Dancing, singing, and drinking wine. This made Shah Shuja very different from his elder brother Dara. Dara was drawn toward intellectual and religious exploration. Shah Shuja was more comfortable navigating political relationships while also indulging heavily in the pleasures available to a Mughal prince. Then there was the third son, Aurangzeb. In 1648, he was 29 years old. Aurangzeb possessed a personality very different from either Dara Shukoh or Shah Shuja. He lacked the polished urbanity associated with his elder brothers. Contemporary accounts instead portray him as intensely focused, highly capable, and sometimes melancholy. François Bernier described Aurangzeb as reserved and subtle, a man who had mastered the art of concealing his intentions. To Bernier, Aurangzeb sometimes appeared to reject worldly luxury while secretly working toward a greater political position. This judgment must also be understood as Bernier's interpretation of the prince. Yet there is little doubt that Aurangzeb was ambitious. He was also deeply religious. But his religious outlook was fundamentally different from Dara's. Dara's religious curiosity was broad, intellectual, and inclusive. He was fascinated by different traditions and searched for common ground between them. Aurangzeb rejected this approach. He was a strong advocate of a stricter and more orthodox form of Sunni Islam. The difference between the brothers was not simply a matter of personality. It also became visible in their political actions. While serving as governor of Gujarat, Aurangzeb attempted to take control of premises belonging to a Jain temple. Dara intervened and prevented him from doing so. The episode demonstrated the growing ideological distance between the two brothers. Dara represented a more open and exploratory approach to religion. Aurangzeb represented a much stricter interpretation of Sunni orthodoxy. And beneath these differences lay another problem. The relationship between Aurangzeb and his father, Shah Jahan, was deeply troubled. Of the four brothers, Aurangzeb appears to have had the most difficult relationship with the emperor. He repeatedly tried to win Shah Jahan's approval. But Shah Jahan often rebuffed him. Aurangzeb's letters to his sister Jahanara reveal how deeply this affected him. He believed that his father considered him undeserving of confidence and trust. His words, as reported in his letters, expressed profound despair over what he saw as his unfortunate position. For a prince who was ambitious, capable, and determined to prove himself, the feeling that his own father did not trust him was deeply painful. The Venetian traveler Niccolò Manucci later identified what he believed was the central cause of Aurangzeb's alienation. According to Manucci, Aurangzeb knew that his father did not love him. Whether that assessment fully explains the relationship is difficult to know. But the emotional distance between Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb was real enough to leave a lasting impression. And it reflected a much older pattern within the Mughal dynasty. Jahangir had once felt that his own father, Akbar, did not love or appreciate him sufficiently. Later, Shah Jahan himself had developed resentment and distrust toward Jahangir. Now that same cycle appeared to be repeating itself. A Mughal emperor, a powerful son, a relationship shaped by suspicion, disappointment, and the struggle for approval. By 1648, Shah Jahan stood at the height of his visible power. He had created magnificent cities. He had built monumental mosques and palaces. He had surrounded his court with extraordinary wealth, and his 4 adult sons were now powerful figures in their own right. Dara Shukoh, the intellectual prince. Shah Shuja, the politically skilled and pleasure-loving prince. Aurangzeb, the disciplined, ambitious, and deeply orthodox prince. And Murad Bash, the youngest, only 23 years old. Together, these 4 princes represented the future of the Mughal dynasty. But they did not represent the same future. Their personalities were different. Their religious outlooks were different. Their political instincts were different. And, most importantly, their relationships with their father were not equal. As Shah Jahan increasingly withdrew from direct military command and entrusted campaigns to his sons, these differences became more important than ever. The emperor had spent decades building monuments that would proclaim the glory of his reign. But the greatest challenge facing his dynasty would not be carved in marble. It would emerge from within his own family. By 1646, Shah Jahan was looking beyond the immediate borders of his empire once again. His attention had turned toward a dream that had haunted Mughal rulers for generations. Samarkand, the legendary Central Asian city associated with his great ancestor, Timur. The opportunity seemed to have arrived at last. Political disorder among the Uzbeks created an opening, and Shah Jahan decided to act. But the man he chose to lead the first major advance was not the son most closely associated with religious scholarship or court politics. It was Murad Bash, his youngest surviving son by Mumtaz Mahal. Murad was very different from his brothers. Contemporary observer François Bernier portrayed him as a pleasure-loving prince who preferred adventure and personal enjoyment to the complicated maneuvering of court politics. He was passionate about hunting, disliked intrigue, and placed his confidence in his own physical courage and his sword. For Shah Jahan, however, Murad's assignment was about far more than military glory. The emperor wanted to reclaim the Central Asian world from which the Mughal dynasty traced its ancestry. In 1646, Murad was sent north with a formidable army. Around 50,000 cavalry accompanied the expedition, supported by roughly 10,000 musketeers, rocket troops, and artillerymen. Faced with such a powerful force, several local rulers withdrew rather than risk confrontation. The advance continued toward the Oxus River. Then came the capture of Balkh. For Shah Jahan, This should have been the beginning of the final push toward Samarkand. The legendary city was still within reach, roughly 170 miles farther north. But Murad stopped. The emperor urged his son to continue and offered him the governorship of Samarkand as an incentive. Yet Murad did not share his father's emotional attachment to the harsh Central Asian lands associated with their ancestors. The climate, the unfamiliar environment, and the distance from Hindustan held little attraction for him. Instead, he abandoned the expedition and returned to Lahore without waiting for his father's permission. Shah Jahan was furious. Murad was stripped of his rank and excluded from the imperial court. But Murad's decision revealed a problem far greater than the disobedience of one prince. The Mughal army itself was struggling to adapt to Central Asia. Even Rajput troops serving in the imperial forces retreated toward the Indus. When orders came for them to turn around and resume the campaign, their reluctance reflected the enormous difficulties of the expedition. The region was unfamiliar. The climate was severe. The local population was viewed with hostility. And the soldiers had little desire to remain so far from the customs and environment of Hindustan. The dream of Timur's homeland was proving far more difficult to recover than Shah Jahan had imagined. The emperor now turned to another son. Aurangzeb was recalled from Gujarat and placed in command. Unlike Murad, Aurangzeb possessed the determination required for a difficult campaign. But determination alone could not overcome the geography and resistance of Central Asia. The Mughal forces were repeatedly harassed by Uzbek and Turkoman opponents. Progress became painfully slow, and the army struggled to achieve a decisive result. Yet Aurangzeb's conduct under pressure impressed his own soldiers. During one battle, at the appointed hour for evening prayer, the prince reportedly stopped amid the fighting, unfolded his prayer mat, and performed his religious duties while the battle continued around him. To his troops, the sight demonstrated extraordinary courage and devotion. But bravery could not change the strategic reality. By the end of the summer of 1647, Aurangzeb was forced to withdraw toward Kabul before the approaching winter made the mountain routes impassable. The retreat itself became a disaster. Thousands of soldiers were lost in the freezing mountain conditions. The entire campaign had consumed approximately 20 million rupees. And after all that expenditure, the Mughal Empire had gained no permanent territory. For Shah Jahan, this was a serious warning. His reign had already become increasingly expensive. Monumental architecture was consuming enormous resources, while the imperial treasury was under growing financial pressure. Now military failure had added another burden. And the consequences were about to become even more severe. The Mughal Empire had once captured Kandahar from the Persians. But while Shah Jahan's attention and military resources were concentrated on the Central Asian campaign, the Persian ruler seized the opportunity to take the city back. Kandahar fell in February 1649. The siege lasted only 57 days. Inside the fortress was a Mughal garrison of approximately 7,000 men. According to the Mughal chroniclers, the defenders surrendered in exchange for their lives. Shah Jahan had already acted before the surrender became known. Upon learning that Kandahar was under attack, he dispatched Aurangzeb with an army of 50,000 men. But winter intervened. The harsh mountain conditions slowed the Mughal advance, and Aurangzeb could not reach Kandahar until the middle of May, roughly 3 months after the Persians had already taken control of the fortress. The opportunity had been lost. Aurangzeb laid siege to the city, but his army lacked the heavy artillery necessary to break through its defenses. By early September, he had no choice but to abandon the attempt. The defeat was a humiliating blow. But Shah Jahan was not prepared to accept it as final. In 1652, Aurangzeb was ordered to try again. Once more, the Mughal army surrounded Kandahar. Once more, the fortress resisted. After only 2 months, Shah Jahan ordered the army to withdraw. This time, the emperor's frustration turned directly toward his son. Shah Jahan blamed Aurangzeb for the failure and questioned how a commander given such substantial resources could have failed to capture the fortress. Aurangzeb wanted another opportunity, but his father's response was bitter. If Shah Jahan had truly believed that Aurangzeb was capable of taking Kandahar, he implied, the army would never have been recalled in the first place. The exchange revealed something deeper than military disagreement. The relationship between father and son was becoming increasingly strained. Aurangzeb was a capable commander, but he could not secure the victories his father demanded. Shah Jahan's confidence in him was already fragile, and every failed expedition deepened the distance between them. Then, in December of that same year, Aurangzeb passed through Agra. There, he visited the tomb of his mother, Taj Mahal. The journey carried a significance that went beyond religious observance. Mumtaz had been the one parent whose relationship with Shah Jahan's sons was remembered as deeply affectionate. For Aurangzeb, whose relationship with his father had become increasingly difficult, the visit may also have been a return to the memory of a mother whose affection had not depended on political success. But what Aurangzeb discovered at the Taj Mahal disturbed him. The monument built in Mumtaz's memory was suffering from leaks. Water was entering parts of the complex during the rainy season. The Great Dome itself had developed leaks in several places. Other areas were also affected, including sections of the upper structures, smaller domes, and the northern vestibules. Repairs had already been attempted, but Aurangzeb was not convinced that the problem had been permanently solved. He immediately informed Shah Jahan. The emperor had spent enormous sums creating one of the most extraordinary monuments of his reign. Yet now, years after its completion, even the Taj Mahal required constant attention. The report from Aurangzeb carried an uncomfortable irony. The emperor who had devoted immense resources to architecture was now confronted with the reality that magnificent buildings were not permanent simply because they were magnificent. They required maintenance. They demanded money, and they could deteriorate. For Aurangzeb, standing at the tomb of his mother, the discovery must have carried an additional weight. The monument represented Shah Jahan's devotion to Mumtaz Mahal. But it also stood as a reminder of everything that had changed since her death. The emperor's greatest love was buried there. His empire was spending heavily on buildings and costly wars. His campaigns in Central Asia had failed. Kandahar had been lost to the Persians. And his relationship with his own sons was becoming increasingly complicated. Even the monument built to preserve Mumtaz's memory was beginning to show signs of age. The Taj Mahal still stood. But behind its white marble beauty, cracks, both literal and political, were beginning to appear. The report Aurangzeb sent from Agra did not end with the discovery of water damage. The Taj Mahal's builders, according to his account, had been unable to devise a satisfactory solution for the problems affecting the Great Dome. The situation was serious enough to prompt an appeal for imperial intervention. Aurangzeb also brought Shah Jahan's attention to another part of the complex, the Mehtab Bagh, the garden located across the Yamuna from the Taj Mahal. The garden had been overwhelmed by flooding. Its beauty had been diminished, although the octagonal pool and the pavilion surrounding it had survived in good condition. Aurangzeb urged his father to respond, suggesting that even a small measure of imperial attention could help restore the site. Shah Jahan acted. Major repair work was undertaken. Efforts were made to reinforce the foundations and protect the Great Dome against further water damage. But while the Taj Mahal was being repaired, Shah Jahan's attention was once again drawn toward a military objective that had already consumed enormous resources. Kandahar. The fortress had resisted 2 Mughal campaigns. Yet Shah Jahan was not prepared to accept permanent defeat. In 1653, he authorized a third attempt. This time, command went to his eldest son, Dara Shukoh. Dara was the prince closest to his father's side. He was deeply involved in court life and spent much of his time with Shah Jahan. Unlike his brothers, however, he had limited experience as a battlefield commander. That made his confidence particularly dangerous. Dara had reportedly claimed that he could capture Kandahar within a single week. Shah Jahan gave him the opportunity to prove it. The resources placed under Dara's command were enormous. He received an army of approximately 70,000 men, substantial artillery, and experienced European mercenary gunners. The expectation was clear. This time, Kandahar would fall. Instead, the siege dragged on. For 5 months, Dara's forces attacked the fortress, but the defenses remained intact. The walls were constructed from exceptionally strong dry clay and, in some places, were nearly 30 feet thick. The Mughal artillery could not create the breakthrough Dara needed. The campaign ended in failure. After 3 attempts, the Mughal Empire had still failed to recover Kandahar. And the cost had become staggering. The 3 unsuccessful campaigns had consumed approximately 120 million rupees, an amount equal to roughly half of Shah Jahan's annual revenue. But the financial loss was not the only damage. For an emperor who had built his reputation on military success, repeated defeat carried a profound personal humiliation. Shah Jahan had known victory during his own years as a prince. Now, as emperor, he had watched one expedition after another fail against the same fortress. Yet Dara's failure did not destroy his father's affection for him. Quite the opposite. Shah Jahan continued to elevate Dara's position. In 1654, during the celebrations marking the emperor's 65th lunar birthday, Dara received a special title that publicly reinforced his position as heir apparent. The symbolism was unmistakable. Shah Jahan ordered Dara to sit on a golden chair positioned close to the imperial throne. The message to the Mughal court was clear. Dara stood nearest to the emperor. Contemporary portraits from this period further emphasized his privileged position, presenting him with an almost symbolic radiance around his head. For the other princes, such signals could not be ignored. And one son, in particular, had every reason to notice. Aurangzeb. While Dara's influence at court was increasing, Aurangzeb had once again been appointed governor of the Deccan and had departed for the south. The 2 brothers were now moving in very different directions. Dara remained close to their father, surrounded by imperial favor. Aurangzeb was far away, governing a difficult province and increasingly convinced that he could not depend on his father's affection. Neither Shah Jahan nor Aurangzeb could have known it at the time, but this departure would carry a painful finality. Although both men still had many years ahead of them, they would never again meet face to face. The distance between them was especially poignant when compared with the family's earlier history. Decades before, during Shah Jahan's rebellion against his father, Jahangir, Shah Jahan had been forced to leave his young sons, Aurangzeb and Dara, in the uncertain care of Nur Jahan. Now history seemed to be repeating itself in a different form. The father and son were separated again. But this time, the separation was not simply geographic. It was emotional. Shah Jahan repeatedly slighted Aurangzeb, showing him far less affection than he showed Dara. Even small matters could become sources of resentment. At one point, Shah Jahan reportedly criticized Aurangzeb for failing to send him the finest mangoes from his favorite tree. The complaint may have seemed trivial, but to Aurangzeb, it reflected something much larger, the persistent feeling that his father valued him less than his elder brother. The problem became more serious when Aurangzeb requested additional funds to administer the Deccan. Shah Jahan refused. Instead of providing more money, the emperor instructed his son to increase revenue through more effective tax collection and better cultivation of the land. Aurangzeb now faced a difficult choice. His province required resources. His father would not provide them. And the prince began looking elsewhere. If revenue could not be obtained through administration, perhaps it could be acquired through conquest. His attention turned toward Golconda. The kingdom was wealthy, and its reputation for gold and diamonds made it an extremely tempting target. Its ruler was portrayed by contemporary accounts as a luxury-loving sultan, and Aurangzeb saw an opportunity to expand Mughal power while replenishing his own financial resources. There were also political arguments that could be used to justify intervention. Golconda had accepted Mughal suzerainty in 1636. Under the terms of that arrangement, tribute was expected. Aurangzeb argued that the payment had fallen behind. He also accused Golconda of expanding into the Carnatic without Mughal authorization. The Carnatic lay south of the Deccan, between the Krishna and Kaveri rivers, and consisted of numerous smaller principalities. For Aurangzeb, these disputes provided a justification. But beneath the political claims was another attraction. Golconda was rich, and Aurangzeb wanted access to that wealth. In early 1656, he moved. An army was sent into Golconda under the command of his 16-year-old son, Muhammad Sultan. Aurangzeb followed with another large force. The situation changed rapidly. The ruler of Golconda, alarmed by the Mughal advance, agreed to Aurangzeb's demands. But Aurangzeb was not satisfied. His campaign had already begun, and he appeared determined to continue. His instructions to Muhammad Sultan were severe. The prince was told to eliminate the sultan if circumstances allowed, expressed in the period's own language as removing the burden of his head. The ruler of Golconda now found himself facing an overwhelming threat. He abandoned the glittering new city of Hyderabad and fled westward toward the fortress of Golconda. From there, he attempted to save his kingdom through diplomacy. Gifts were sent. Conciliatory messages followed. Even the Sultan's own mother was sent in an appeal for mercy. But the ruler also sought help from someone else. Dara Shukoh. Dara's personality was very different from Aurangzeb's. He was naturally more inclined toward negotiation and reconciliation. And he had another reason to intervene. Aurangzeb was his brother, and the two men were already rivals. Dara therefore stepped into the dispute, attempting to prevent Aurangzeb from destroying the kingdom. At the same time, Aurangzeb was campaigning for another outcome. He wrote directly to his father, describing Golconda as a land of extraordinary abundance. He emphasized its water, population, climate, agriculture, and above all, its capacity to generate wealth. To Aurangzeb, annexing Golconda offered Shah Jahan something the empire desperately needed: money. But Shah Jahan was not persuaded. Despite the pressure on the imperial treasury, he rejected the idea of annexing the kingdom. Instead, he accepted Dara's argument that a negotiated settlement would be both more practical and more just. The emperor ordered Aurangzeb to accept the indemnity offered by Golconda's ruler and withdraw. The decision was a direct rebuke to Aurangzeb's ambitions. Shah Jahan also accused his son of taking jewels belonging to the Sultan. He refused to allow Aurangzeb to keep any of the indemnity, and he reprimanded him for going beyond the authority he had been given. Once again, Aurangzeb had been checked by his father. Once again, Dara's influence had prevailed. Aurangzeb had little choice but to obey. Reluctantly, he withdrew his forces from Golconda. But even in retreat, he managed to secure something for himself. Before leaving, he pressured the ruler of Golconda into arranging a marriage between one of the Sultan's daughters and Aurangzeb's own son. The immediate crisis had ended. But the deeper conflict had not. Shah Jahan had chosen Dara over Aurangzeb. He had denied Aurangzeb the conquest of Golconda. He had refused him the wealth he sought. And once again, the emperor's decisions had reinforced the growing divide between his two sons. The Mughal Empire was still vast. Its emperor was still powerful. But beneath the grandeur of Shah Jahan's court, the struggle over loyalty, authority, wealth, and succession was becoming impossible to ignore. Aurangzeb's campaign in Golconda had ended with his withdrawal, but he had managed to secure an important political advantage before leaving. His son, Muhammad Sultan, had married the daughter of the Sultan of Golconda, and Aurangzeb had also obtained a secret promise that his new son-in-law would eventually be appointed heir to the Golconda throne. With Golconda temporarily out of his reach, Aurangzeb turned his attention toward another wealthy Deccan kingdom, Bijapur. Bijapur had, like Golconda, accepted Mughal suzerainty in 1636. But in the years that followed, the kingdom had grown considerably richer. The opportunity for intervention came after the death of Bijapur's ruler in November 1656, when internal conflict created a convenient pretext for Mughal military action. This time, Shah Jahan permitted Aurangzeb to proceed. The emperor's decision was influenced by the arrival of a powerful Persian adventurer named Mir Jumla. Mir Jumla had previously served as vizier to the Sultan of Golconda, but after falling out with the ruler, he turned toward the Mughal court. Mir Jumla knew the value of presenting the right gift to the right emperor. He brought Shah Jahan diamonds, rubies, and topaz associated with the immense wealth of Golconda and Bijapur. The treasures convinced the emperor that these kingdoms were worth more than simply remaining under Mughal overlordship and paying tribute. Their wealth made direct conquest and annexation appear increasingly attractive. Shah Jahan rewarded Mir Jumla with high office and authorized Aurangzeb to launch a full-scale invasion of Bijapur. The emperor also gave Aurangzeb permission to annex Golconda if he succeeded in his campaign against Bijapur. In early 1657, Aurangzeb advanced into Bijapur territory with Mir Jumla at his side. His method was deliberate and systematic. Rather than depending entirely on military force, Aurangzeb attempted to weaken the Bijapuri state by encouraging its officers to defect. He offered 2,000 rupees to every Bijapuri officer who would change sides and bring 100 men with him. Aurangzeb was personally courageous. His reputation for bravery had existed since his youth. According to the account of his early life, when he was only 14 years old, he had famously confronted a rampaging elephant that was about to trample him and had thrown his spear at the enraged animal. Yet his approach to warfare was different from the more aggressive military style associated with Shah Jahan. Aurangzeb preferred a slower and more methodical campaign. Shah Jahan, however, became concerned that the approaching monsoon would arrive before his son had achieved his objectives. Dara Shukoh's influence also affected the emperor's decision. Shah Jahan therefore ordered Aurangzeb to bring the campaign to a rapid conclusion. Instead of permitting the complete conquest of Bijapur, the emperor instructed his son to negotiate a treaty. Under the settlement, Bijapur would pay the Mughals a huge indemnity and surrender several forts, but the kingdom itself would remain independent. Aurangzeb reluctantly accepted his father's orders. His campaigns in the Deccan had not produced spectacular territorial conquests, but they had further strengthened Mughal influence in the region. They also provided some compensation for the earlier failures of Shah Jahan's military ambitions. The Central Asian expedition had ended unsuccessfully. The attempts to recover Kandahar had also failed. Now, despite Aurangzeb's campaigns, the Deccan had not been fully conquered. Yet Shah Jahan still had 4 adult sons who could lead military operations whenever the empire required them. The emperor could therefore have expected a period of relative peace as he entered old age. He could continue his architectural projects and, when he visited Agra, pray at the marble mausoleum he had built for Mumtaz Mahal. Instead, in September 1657, everything changed. Shah Jahan, now 65 years old, fell dangerously ill. His illness created the crisis that his 3 younger sons had been waiting for. For years, Shah Jahan's authority had kept the ambitions of his sons under control. But the sudden threat to the emperor's life changed the political situation completely. The question of who would succeed Shah Jahan could no longer remain distant. The emperor's illness marked the beginning of the struggle that would determine the future of the Mughal Empire.